Well, the quantum domain arises because as we probed into the behavior of matter around about the beginning of the last century, we found that the atoms were behaving in a way which we could not understand in terms of classical physics. And that there was a very puzzling way of behavior. And then it was Heisenberg who actually spotted that it was how to change the description from the classical description into a quantum description, which then would account for atomic spectra in particular. And the change in the mathematics was in a way quite dramatic. It changed from simply thinking about particles with positions and momentum and evolving in space and time to something which forbid us to actually talk about positions or to measure positions and momentum simultaneously. And if you make the argument that they must exist simultaneously, then the classical domain is not open to you, and you then have to have an entirely new way of describing the phenomena. And this occurs not at the macroscopic level, but it becomes very evident as we get down to the atomic, the molecular, the atomic and subatomic levels. We have to use instruments to see what is going on, and therefore we do not directly perceive what is going on. So we have to understand how our instruments are working in order to see. And what we find is that if we assume that the instruments are doing what we think they're doing, we get into this dilemma that it is not possible to measure the position and the momentum of a particle at the same time, at one at the same time. So this now makes us say, okay, we've got a question now. Does it mean that atoms don't have position and momentum at a given time? Or is it just simply mean that we can't measure the momentums and a position at a certain time? And this gives us the choice. The Copenhagen interpretation says we don't know whether they have a position and momentum at the same time, but there's nothing we can say about it even if they did have a position and momentum at the same time. And that left us with a very vague idea that we don't know, or we can't ever find out what is going on underneath the measurements that we're getting. And therefore, there is a concentration on what we can measure and how the measurements are related to each other. This is in contrast to people like Einstein and the people in classical physics who believe that there is something underlying this. And the question is, we can make speculations about this and actually try to develop a theory which shows us what is going on beneath this apparent uncertainty. And it was this the message that David Bohm took up and showed that even within the Schrödinger equation, by technically splitting it into a real and imaginary part, splitting into two coupled equations, that one suddenly saw that one equation looked very much like a classical equation, that it was a particle evolving along a trajectory, but it had a new feature to it, and it's the feature that we have called the quantum potential. It seemed almost as if there was another force being generated from the subquantum medium. And the question has always been, what does that mean? Is it there? What does it mean? And how do we get information about it? Bohr had this idea that we could not say anything about the underlying reality. And people have taken that also to mean that there may not be an underlying reality. Einstein completely disagreed with this point of view. He thought there must be an underlying reality, and this underlying reality would produce the effects we actually see in our instruments. Now the question then was, what is that underlying reality? At the time, there was a feeling that because quantum mechanics was essentially statistical, we got all our results of measurements by repeating them and getting a statistical value for these things, that maybe that we can find something which can explain that statistics by introducing new variables. And these new variables were called hidden variables. And this set off a whole exercise in trying to develop hidden variable theories. What Bohm did when he came along was to be influenced by Einstein in a way that he also felt that there was something underlying the statistical features. And what he did was to take the Schrödinger equation, split it into its real and imaginary parts, that is, split it into two equations which were coupled. One equation looked remarkably like a classical equation of motion, but it had a very big difference. And the difference was that there was a new energy seemed to be involved, and this new energy manifested itself in terms of a quantum potential, as they called it. And this gave rise to a new force which only worked in the quantum domain. And if you go to the classical domain, this force becomes zero. So he was then developed his ideas of particles following trajectories. But to do that, he did not have to introduce hidden variables. All he used was the variables that were being used in quantum mechanics anyway. But he was using them more like classical variables than abstract operators as the conventional approach uses. So what we've got here is that we can describe quantum phenomena in terms of the variables of classical physics, but then how can this be? Because Heisenberg has already shown us that we can't use the classical variables without changing the mathematical structure into what is known as non-commutativity. That is, x, the way x and p behave. If you talk about x first and then p, it's different from talking about p first and then x. So the whole idea of the evolution of a quantum process is not classical. Something new would have to be involved in this. And it was actually Dirac who said, well, we can't talk about a trajectory going through in the classical sense. But what we can do is we can look at the process of slowly unfolding into one process and then enfolding into another. So there's the whole process of folding and enfolding actually occurring. And there is a transition between these states. And it's this transition that is the thing which we've been focusing on recently. Remember, we're talking about wholeness. We have to have wholeness in here. Here we agree with Bohr. Bohr pointed out that it was very important. The new feature that quantum mechanics introduces is a kind of wholeness, which means we cannot analyze things by cutting them up into little bits as we do in classical physics. But what we can do is, if we want to try and cut it up, that the way one bit goes into the next bit actually involves unfolding into the whole and then enfolding back again into a particular region. And so you get this idea of unfolding, enfolding, unfolding, enfolding. So what looks like a continuous trajectory is actually a series of foldings and unfoldings. And Dirac essentially had this idea but gave it up. What Bohm has done is to say, don't give it up. Dirac thought that the uncertainty principle would be violated if you went down this road. And in fact, Dirac actually got the equations, which were almost the Bohm equations, but he dismissed them. He got them to first order in h bar, the Planck's constant, but dismissed them because he thought the Heisenberg uncertainty relation would be violated. What David Bohm did was to show that it would not be violated, that you would still retain the uncertainty principle, but then the question of what these trajectories mean becomes important. And this is where he then said, well, let me be bold and say there is this unfolding and enfolding actually going on, nothing to do with measurement. It is the actual process itself unfolding. And we can make speculations about this unfolding, and this is in fact what people were doing in field theory, but they abandoned it because measurement seemed to be the primary aim of physicists. If we're talking about measurements, we know what we're talking about. Seems to be the way one goes, rather than saying what we should be talking about, as Einstein suggested, was speculations about the underlying movement, which then produce observable effects, and we then go to the laboratory and see, do these effects, are they actually there? What David Bohm was suggesting was that we agree with the assumptions that you make, namely that there is a guidance condition in the mathematics, and that the equation, the real part of the Schrödinger equation, is telling us something about the energy distribution in a given system. And what you see is it's an energy conservation equation, provided you introduce this new quality of energy called the quantum potential energy. And this quantum potential energy only functions when quantum phenomena appear. That is, in the particle approaching two slits, it is the quantum potential that organizes the way the individual trajectories work. So there is a dynamic whole process going on in which the quantum potential appears. Now, do you want to take that as real or not? Well, what the new things that are coming on the scene is that we can actually perhaps measure effects which will reveal this quantum potential. And then if it satisfies, if the experiments tell us that the way it reveals itself is correct, then we can say the quantum potential is actually there. But there's a big debate about what it is actually going to be, because remember, this is coming from the non-commutative underlying process. And nowadays we are beginning to think that underlying process is actually to do with the actual structure of space and time. That itself may not be continuous as we imagine. We don't have continuous geometries, but we have a non-commutative geometry. And the big question is, what is the form of that non-commutative geometry? What sort of insights do we get about it? How are we going to think about it? How are we going to reformulate our ideas to find out exactly what non-commutative geometry means in everyday terms? The question of existence is very, very interesting here, because what we see is that in the non-commutative structure there doesn't appear to be any quantum potential. But when we project it into a phase space, a space-time manifold, a classical, the quantum potential appears. So now does that mean the quantum potential is real or not?
Okay, but can I then...
Can I take an analogy with that? Let's go back to gravity. Remember, the gravitational force is not a force. The gravitational force arises because space-time has got a curvature in it. That space-time is not Euclidean, it's Riemannian. Therefore, what is revealed as a force is actually a feature of the underlying geometry. And what I feel is that the quantum potential is a feature of the underlying non-commutative geometry. Now, in that sense, is it real or is it artificial? The point is, it's pointing to the fact that we need a new geometry, and we're trying to find out features of that non-commutative geometry, and that's a very active field at the moment, with many speculations about how this would arise. The quantum potential is a way of talking about this thing to take some of the mystery out of the quantum phenomena. With the quantum potential, you don't have schizophrenic cats that are alive and dead at the same time. With the quantum potential, the cat is either alive or dead. With the quantum potential, you explain the qualities that gives you the interference without the need for introducing a wave function. And the wave function has been getting in the way, in my view, because we have this wretched measurement problem in which the wave function is behaving in an evolutionary manner through Schrödinger's equation, and then when we look at it, it collapses. And we have this collapse problem which has been going now for 50, 60 or 100 years, and it still has no solution. And maybe it has no solution because it is not relevant. We have got the thing wrong. When I first joined David Bohm, we didn't talk about his hidden variable 52 paper. What we were talking about was how could we get quantum mechanics and gravity, general relativity, into one theory? How could we quantize the gravitational field? Fortunately, we had Roger Penrose with us at Birkbeck at the time, and David Bohm, Roger Penrose, myself, and some mathematicians used to meet and talk about this problem. So we were talking about ideas like pre-space. How are we going to put quantum mechanics into this pre-space idea so that we would have quantum space-times emerging from this? So what is a quantum space-time? This was what the discussion was about. Roger Penrose was talking about his spin networks, which has now become quite a big industry in some areas. He was developing his twistors. And it was developing his twistors that led me into the Clifford algebra approach, which is a non-commutative algebra, which is why I'm always talking about non-commutative algebras. At that time, David Bohm was developing a new idea which was called structure process. That basically we want to start with process, not particles moving in space-time, but a process from which both particles and space-time can emerge. Very radical ideas. During that discussions, what we were thinking about was that the process, how are we going to describe this process? And then I think I was reading some work by Grassmann and Clifford way back in the 1850s to 1900s. And they were talking about process essentially, but they weren't calling it process. They were talking about activity, about order. And they were saying, and Grassmann in particular was saying, that really mathematics was not about material processes, it was about thought. So if we are thinking about the underlying processes in terms of some sort of new radical idea, we need to develop the mathematics to actually encompass that. And what was coming to the fore all the time was that we needed an algebra. And an algebra is essentially something which has both addition and multiplication. And the multiplication became the order of succession, so that if you had a process unfolding, then multiplication was the way it unfolded. Addition was the way it coexisted. So this was pinching an idea from Leibniz, who had this idea of what time was. Time was the order of succession, but there then was also an order of coexistence. Now, can we actually develop an algebra which will encompass that philosophical idea? And that's what we were developing. And that's what I think Penrose was developing with his twistor theory. But I won't go into the details here, but that shows you that was in the background. And it was only much later, I think it was almost after 10 years of me working with David, that Chris Dewdney and Chris Philippides came up to me and said, why don't you talk about the 52 paper? And that's when I said, because I think it's wrong. And that's when Chris said to me, Basil, have you read the paper? And I then had to agree that I hadn't. And when I went away and I saw it, I thought, well, how on earth can he get trajectories out of this non-commutative structure? What do these trajectories look like? What does this quantum potential look like? We can calculate it from known solutions of Schrödinger's equation. And that's what Chris was absolute master at, was actually developing computer programs to actually simulate this, and let's have a look at what is going on here. But unfortunately, people thought I'm speaking now for myself, that I believed this. No, I was puzzled, and always have been puzzled. Even when I wrote the book Undivided Universe with David Bohm, I was still puzzled. How is it that you can have trajectories in this deeper process? We told a story which I think was a very good story, but it wasn't the final story. We left the final chapter open, where we said we needed more radical ideas. And these were the radical ideas that I was hoping David and I would write about, but unfortunately David's time came too soon. So since then I have been trying to develop the continuation of these original process-based ideas, developing a theory of structure process. In quantum mechanics, there's no such thing as a vacuum, being empty of everything. And we ought to bear in mind that even Maxwell didn't think of the vacuum as being empty. He defined the vacuum as being everything that we can take out of it, that we know how to take out of it. So that leaves the unknown possibility. And now in quantum field theory, we have inequivalent vacuum states. So these are states in which there is still activity present. So we never get to the stillness of nothingness. All is in flux. It's not a plenum of particles buzzing backwards and forwards. It's this idea of the energy. Energy is a very interesting concept. We always think that energy goes with particles. We fire a particle with kinetic energy and it goes bang and causes trouble when it hits something. It releases its energy. But does energy have to be concentrated on particles? Quantum field theory tells us no, there is a field. This field carries energy, and it carries energy in a non-local way. The problem is for us, we're trying to describe the universe by getting outside it and then saying, look, there's the valleys, there's the fields, there's the so on. It's the godlike view of reality. Unfortunately, we're right in it. I'm saying there's no hill that we can climb up. That's the illusion. When we do that, we fragment everything. We are in it right at the beginning. Irreducibly in it. We can't separate ourselves and we depend upon it. We depend on the light coming in, the sounds, all our perceptions are coming in. And then we have the arrogance to say, oh, I'm important, I'm on top of the hill, you're not. And so we get into this conflict which is going to go on and on. Unfortunately, we're all in it together. One thing that I want to emphasize when I've been talking here, I have not got a theory which is complete and ready to solve all the problems of the universe. I'm on a journey. The journey is a process. What David and I have done is to open up the discussion, which I find when I'm talking to young people that they're very interested in trying to proceed further with these ideas. In other words, some of them have actually got it, as I put it. They know in their basic feelings that this is an interesting way to go. One of the problems I see happening is that when they talk to their colleagues saying, shall I go in this direction? The colleagues will say, no, it's not safe. But perhaps I ought to just have a personal story. I remember when I started out and I was working with David Bohm, I was told that if I worked with David Bohm, my career would not develop. Fortunately, I'm so pig-headed, I did not take any notice of them. And if this is a failed career, then I'm quite happy with it. So I would encourage, what we've got to do is to encourage radical thoughts. The problem always is that amongst those radical ideas, there is a lot of stuff which just is crazy. And so there's always a difficulty in this area. What should we encourage people to follow, and what we should discourage them? And I can see no other way than if someone is interested, say, in the ideas I've been developing, if they understand where they're coming from, is to encourage them to actually take it further, because I'm not going to be around much longer to actually take it any further, and I've probably reached the limits of trying to explore these ideas. But I do know when I talk to people who get it, they are very excited about how this whole idea of process, pre-space, and quantizing gravity, etc., the direction we should be going in. And I would like to feel that those guys are being encouraged. My worry is, with all the financial constraints, with all the time constraints, that people will take safe views forward. And I don't think being safe is going to solve some of the problems that still remain in this process philosophy with wholeness. My daughter is a primary school teacher, and she is always complaining that the curriculum is killing off any creativity in youngsters. She believes that there should be, yes, information on how you do things, give them the tools, but their creativity should be encouraged at the primary level. But it is not. It is being stifled in this country at the moment. And that doesn't matter whether it's physics, history, philosophy, or anything. We've got to be an educational system which allows people to be creative. And in that creativity, they're going to make mistakes. But if you don't make mistakes, you will never learn anything. So there is a problem with the whole educational system. And by the time they get to university, I find that instead of them coming up with more knowledge than I had when I graduated, they actually have less knowledge. Okay, the knowledge base has increased by a tremendous amount. But how to get across the idea of choosing the relevant information for going forward, this has not been solved as far as I can see. I hope people out there are working on it so that we allow for creativity to develop naturally. But I sometimes look at the political situation and I'm very concerned. David Bohm used to say, we are really poets, using the word poesis, the Greek word which actually means being creative, taking you out of the comfort zone into new ways of thinking, into new ideas. He was always making proposals. He wasn't developing a theory. He was making proposals as to how we can begin to be more creative and look at different aspects and bring them in to a more coherent structure. Coherence was all important to him. Order was the thing that he was interested in. Not chaos, but actually trying to find the right orders in order to express the physical phenomena. David Bohm's contribution was immense, not only in the narrow field of physics, but in terms of society in general. He was someone who, when I started joining him, it was so refreshing. We would talk about all sorts of things if it was relevant for the particular problem that we were dealing with. And David Bohm was dealing with general ideas. He would be dealing with philosophical ideas. We would go into language. Is language limiting the way we can express these ideas? He would go into biology and say, look, this is the way biological systems develop. That nature is surely more organic, and yet we're trying to do in our quantum mechanics is to make it mechanical. Perhaps we should move into that area and say that there is a more organic way of thinking about life in general. And then ultimately he became very fascinated with the role of consciousness in all of this. Where is consciousness? Where does consciousness come in? What is thought? What is thinking? And he would be discussing those and writing very profoundly about those ideas. But he never got into a school, and that was because he would make proposals and then explore these proposals, make other proposals and explore these. So he didn't actually have, if you like, a well-defined theory. It was more, let's move ahead, understanding more and more, but within the context of this philosophy of process and making sure this idea of wholeness is understood in developing these different aspects of the theory. Because he knew it was a challenge. He was very puzzled by this whole thing. It's very easy for us physicists to go back into the mechanical picture. People have done that with David Bohm. They've taken him and said, look, it's Bohmian mechanics. And David said to me, why are they calling it Bohmian mechanics? Haven't they read what I've said? It should be non-mechanics. But this, of course, is just swamped because it's so much easier to talk in terms of classical mechanical ideas. What I feel is that the universe is organic. With the organic, it's not the parts that determine the whole, it is the whole which determine the parts. So the wholeness plays a key role in it. And the way we talk about it is through process and not through particles in it.